So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Annamaree Lloyd. Annamaree is a social science researcher who conducts research into information literacies and contemporary information practices in formal and informal learning connected to workplaces, community settings, libraries, and education. Her research program focuses on the intersection between information, learning, and the performance of information practice. Annamaree is interested in the connection between information literacies, social inclusion and collaborative learning, and the nature of embodiment in information literacy practice. Professor Lloyd pursues this research agenda, working with a range of groups, including refugees, emergency services personnel, nurses, patients with chronic illness, librarians, and students. Professor Lloyd is also engaged with theoretical work associated with the development of information practice, information literacy theory, and landscape methodology. Her most recent research focuses on information practice, risk, and resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Lloyd's theoretical interests center on theory in information literacy, information practice, and information landscape. Her recent conceptual work is focused on developing the concept of dark knowledge. Annamaree has published over 100 refereed journal articles and conference proceedings. She is the author of The Qualitative Landscape of Information Literacy Research, Information Literacy Landscapes, and the co-editor of Information Literacy Through Theory and Practicing Information Literacy. Annamaree's talk today is titled Information Literacy as Social Practice, a Theoretical and Methodological Discussion. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Annamaree Lloyd. And Dr. Lloyd, please take it away.
Hello, everybody. How are you? Well, I'll just share my screen now. Okay, hopefully you've got my screen. It's very nice to meet you all. So as I'm Professor Annamaree Lloyd. Just a little bit about myself. I've worked at the University College of London for a couple of years, where I am now an emeritus professor. I've worked in Sweden, I've worked in Australia. Prior to becoming an academic, I was a librarian in a vocational library, and I also had a lot to do and still have a lot to do with public libraries. So what I'm planning to do today is to try and problematize information literacy a little bit. I want to introduce practice theory. I want to present the theory of information literacy as it's framed by practice. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology. So there is a copy of my slides. I think Mari may have shared that with everyone. I understand this slide deck might be slightly blurry. It's got something to do with the bandwidth in Australia. So I'm quite sorry about that, but it's out of my control. So let's get started. So all right, so I want to talk a little bit about my research journey. It's allowed me to develop my understanding of information literacy as it is in the wild, to borrow March of Bates's phrase. So I've worked with lots of people in emergency services, nurses, librarians, students with refugees for nearly 10 years. I've worked with people who have been suffering chronic illness, people with AIDS, and also people that are faced with the uncertainty of the COVID-19 pandemic that we recently all went through. So my standpoint is that I work from a standpoint where I believe that knowledge is always a view from somewhere, which means that it's socially situated and it's embedded culturally in the historical the institutional discourse, the discursive practices of community, which shape the emplaced actions of people. So from my perspective, knowing is always something that's quite embodied. Now, my research into information practice sits within a sociocultural and practice theoretical tradition, which centres practice as the primary thing that can be interrogated. And it's grounded in a general understanding that knowledge represents a mastery that is articulated and expressed in the ability to carry out a performance and share the accumulated values of experience with others. So as David Nicolini suggests, that becoming part of an existing practice, so an information literacy practice or practice as librarians, it involves learning how to act, how to speak, what to say, but also how to feel, what to expect, and what things mean. So my research is also framed via social constructionism. Therefore, it's focused on the role of people. I'm interested in people who are situated and constructing their worldview and their sense of reality, and by implication, the construction of information and knowledge. So to emphasize an information perspective, I draw from an idea that information and knowledge, when we're researching, they should be viewed as a cultural category where everyday life can be understood in information terms as being composed of different forms of information that are drawn from different sites of knowledge which act to inform us. And that shapes and influences how information and the ability to become informed is experienced and understood by people enmeshed in a setting. So this approach, it directs my researcher's gaze towards problematizing how people encounter and become informed, and in that process, how they build, how they develop, and then how they anchor their information landscapes, of which we have many. From this view, being informed is therefore kind of predicated on being able to develop ways of knowing the practices and the competencies that are required to work with information that is afforded through social, material, or technical mechanisms of a society or a culture. Now, this is a complex view, and it might be quite new to a lot of people, but it enables us to frame an understanding of discourse and discursive privilege, and to acknowledge that in reality, some groups have much better access to information via sites and sources than other people do, other groups do. So my interest doesn't only lie in how in information literacy and how it enables people, but it also lies in the idea of absences. So who is marginalised, what conditions and associated discourses enable and constrain access to information, and what aspect of an information experience might be absent for some people. So connected to this perspective is of information literacy practice is the idea that information literacy, it's constructed by people in practice and as they practice. So context is really significant for understanding the shape of information literacy, which will vary according to the intersubjective relations that are present in a social site. Now, these relations help people within the site to understand what types of and forms of information and knowledge are being authorised and legitimised. Consequently, when we research information literacy as practice, we must remember that information literacy is varied across contexts, and it can have different truths and different ways of knowing. So in some cases, and I know this is a question that I've been asked, the one-size approach for me in relation to information literacy, it doesn't fit all. Information literacy practice, as it's practiced in, say, sciences, is really different to the way information literacy is practiced by firefighters or by nurses or in the arts. So that leads us to now start to think about what is practice theory. So practice theory is a suite of theories that focus on context, on people's actions and behaviours rather than their cognitive processes. Practice theories place emphasis on the routine actions, the material elements, our bodily actions and meanings that all occur within a social context. Practice theory provides a framework for understanding how these elements intersect and are reproduced within a community. They are quite varied, and the landscape of practice theory is often described as being quite unsettled because accounts are situated across a diverse range of traditions, and the exploration of practice happens across a diverse range of contexts. But rather than focus on variations, there are commonalities about the composition of practices, how a practice happens, how they're mediated and communicated in the constitution of social life that we try to focus on. So practice theories, they're loosely tied together and they share their interest in the life world. They share a belief that practices are social and that they're relational. So we relate to each other when we are practicing. Practice theories reject dualism. So they reject that mind-body split that often just leads to a more cognitive view of information literacy, in fact, by acknowledging and centering the body and materiality in all its performances. And practice theories are also viewed, they are processual and they provide a programmatic interrogation, which focuses on the patterning of practices through routine activities and through shared understanding. So when we practice together, we start to develop a shared understanding. I mean, if you think about your own work as librarians, when you first sort of come into the library, you are engaging with different types of information, which allows you to develop a sort of a shared understanding of the project of librarianship. I also draw from the work of Theodore Shatsky, and he presents more an ontological approach. So where all practices are social and they're rendered visible by doings and sayings. So the way people do things and the way people speak, and that connection with material arrangements. And those things hang together, according to Shatsky, and they're organised by a practice understanding, a general understanding of what the rules and regulations are, and more teleoaffective structures. And what that really means is that it's around our intersubjective, where we come to share meaning about what the project of our practice and our work might be. So practices are organised. They're an organised nexus of human activities through which intelligibility occurs. So we're making meaning out of our practice. So the way we do things, the suite of actions and activities and skills and the behaviours and the way we understand how and why things need to be done, all those things create a particular practice. And when we research information literacy from this perspective, what we have to do is consider the context or the social field as a place where social life happens and how it happens through a mesh of entwined practices and arrangements. So we're not just looking at the end product, so the information literacy practice, but we're looking at how that practice actually happens. So, for example, when we teach information literacy, we tend to teach it in a particular way, and we are encouraging a set of skills and attributes. I mean, if you think of your work in an academic library setting or in a school, and those sets of skills and attributes, they conform to the sayings and the doings of our institutions, the rules and the regulations of our institutions, the policies. And we encourage our students to shape their information literacy practice in a way that conforms to the discourses of our institutions and our libraries. What does our library think information literacy should look like? In workplaces, the shape of information literacy will be quite different because people and the forms and the types of knowledge which are authorised and legitimised, they'll also be different. And that's where, through my research, I've come to understand that bodies are quite central to information literacy. So social practices become the starting point for thinking about theorising and human affairs. So just a summary, and I know that there's a lot in this, so just a summary about practice theory. Knowledge is always relational, and it's constructed and brought about by engaging with the discourses of our particular institutions and settings, other practices and tools of a particular setting. Practices have a social, historical and a political trajectory. They don't just pop up, they're built up over time. So they have a temporal and a spatial sort of dimension, and in this regard, context is really important. Meaning making that happens during a practice is a negotiation between people in particular settings. So when you are teaching your students information literacy, there is a negotiation between you and the students about what information literacy might mean. And that leads to the production and the reproduction of identity and ways of interactions. And understanding practice actually requires us to focus more than just on the internalized processes. It also requires us to understand the experimental nature of embodied performance. So adopting a practice view, it kind of allows information literacy to be explored and understood at a much deeper level. And these are the types of questions that we might ask. Now, I'm not going to read all these questions out. They'll be on the slide deck and you can have a look at them. But when we take a practice view, we are therefore seeking to understand the practice of information literacy, how it's shaped, and then how it's operationalised. And this means we need to consider a number of different kinds of questions. We need to look at information literacy in a different way. So we look at it sort of ontologically, where we refer to, and that refers to accounts and beliefs and ideas that people hold about the world. All right. So ontology shapes and reinforces practices and interaction, and it references the different negotiations of truth which constitute people being in the world. So when we strive to understand and ask ontological questions about information literacy, we're moving towards a more critical perspective of IL. And that includes questions about how is the practice shaped and who is it for and who becomes silenced and who becomes marginalised. When we look at it epistemologically, we're looking at ways of knowing, and ways of knowing are in themselves forms of skillful practice and pragmatic knowledge, which is accessed in situ, and it's linked to an acknowledgement of how the ontological features position the conditions of knowing. And then we can also ask questions that are methodological. Sorry. And we'll come to that a bit later on when we talk about method. Okay, so, but methodologically, what we're asking questions about is how do we actually capture the practice? How do we capture and understand the practice? So that kind of leads me to TOIL. Now, TOIL is the theory of information literacy. It's been in development for quite a long time, and I presented it in 2017, and it's currently the topic of a new book that we're currently writing. So theory of information literacy states that the practice of information literacy affords opportunities to connect with information-rich, social, textual, instrumental, and corporeal modalities, which are sources that emerge from an information environment, shaping its practice and its landscape. Excuse me for a minute. According to the theory, information literacy is positioned as a practice that is enacted within a social setting. And when we explore the practice of information literacy, we can see that it's composed of a suite of patterns and activities and ways of communicating and understanding that reference structured and embodied knowledges and ways of knowing that are relevant to the context. So again, information literacy in an academic setting might be very different to information literacy as it's done in a science lab. And information literacy, it's a way of knowing, and the practice has its own landscape, and it creates information landscapes. So in the practice of information literacy, people connect not only with text, but with the linked materials that are linked to their settings, and they draw from the social, epistemic, and the physical corporeal modalities of information, and through that connection, they form and shape their information landscapes. So the theory of information literacy therefore advocates that a broader understanding of information literacy is a social practice, which when enacted, it connects people with information through the signs, the symbols, the materiality, and the embodiment that's associated with the sayings and the doings of practice. Information literacy is a practice which is a constituent part of other practices in everyday life. It's something that weaves through all of the activities that we and practices that we engage with in our daily life. So foundationally, information literacy, like all other practice, is enacted, and it's enacted in ways that draw from sources of information that reference knowledge bases, that recognises ways of knowing that are valued by members of the setting, that engages in activities that form part of the individual and collective performances, and that use the material objects and artefacts that are sanctioned as part of the performance. So consequently, when we become information literate, or becoming information literate, I should say, that requires the development of a meaningful understanding of how knowledge is constructed, located, situated, and valued within a landscape, and the range of activities that enable information to be drawn from that knowledge base. And I think that that's something that that people, when they're coming into a new sort of environment or context, they are doing that all the time. They're trying to work out, you know, what information is important, what isn't, what's being valued by that sort of the people that are in that particular context. And that also then requires competence. It requires relevant skills and knowledge and ability to relate to social and material practices. So because it's enacted in a social setting, context, it determines which information, knowledge, and ways of knowing are valued and are being promoted. And when we practice information literacy, we reference a way of knowing. And this definition that I've provided of information literacy, it acknowledges that information literacy can be played out in different ways, depending on the context. So, for example, something I should also mention too, in another life, I was also an archaeologist. So there are a few archaeological references in this. So information literacy in a non-Indigenous setting, so knowledges and the ways of knowing may be quite different to information literacy in Indigenous settings or even in gendered settings. So it also brings bodies into our analysis of the practice because it centres enactment and embodied knowledge. So my argument is that information literacy should not be seen as an afterthought, something that's kind of tacked on to the end, even though I know that that's how it's happening in lots of places. But it should be seen as a really critical social practice that is situated and that connects people with the signs, the symbols, the artifacts that are related to their practice. So to give you another archaeological reference, when people go to a museum, they view prehistoric artifacts, so stone tools, for instance. And most people, when they see them, they'll read the description provided and they'll understand the object in terms of its age and its purported use. As an archaeologist, when I view stone tools in the museum, I access another layer of information that's embodied in the artifact. So the type of rock used will tell me where the artifact came from and whether there might have been trade. The way the tool is knapped, the way it's made, will tell me a bit about the expertise of the person that made that tool. Its wear patterns will tell me what it's used for, the conditions that enable it, all those conditions that enable it to emerge as a technology. Now, the information that's available to the museum observer is very different from the information that's afforded the archaeologist. And that in turn is also different for traditional owners, for Indigenous people whose understanding is infused with deeper cultural understanding. So the idea that information is a cultural category rests in this kind of example. So engaging with a broad range of people employed in a wider range of these activities has led me to develop this theory and the model as a way of highlighting the importance of information drawn from multiple sources to inform both formal and informal learning and to accommodate the idea that information really is everywhere. Now, before I turn to a research perspective, I want to also turn to some key selected findings from my research, which has kind of led to the development of toil. And before I do that, now I'm sorry this is going to be quite blurry. You will be able to see it on the slides, but this is what the model of information literacy looks like. Okay, and now it's derived from lots and lots of groups that I've worked with over 23 years of study. Okay, and from this model and from the theory, a number of statements can be made that the practice of information literacy emerges through the social, physical, and the epistemic and instrumental modalities that shape the landscape, which represent ways of knowing about the collective forms of knowledge, which shape larger, more stable information environments. Information literacy is enacted through literacies of information. Other people say information literacies, but I say literacies of information because I think that it really kind of highlights the information element. And that refers to context, all right? And people becoming information literate is a process of transition and iteration as people move between novice, expert, novice position. So we're always learning when we engaging with information literacy practice. We're always in a sort of transitional period where we're always moving and we're learning and then going through various stages. So the model is informed by the view that the primary purpose of information literacy is to develop a way of knowing about the sources of information that comprise an information environment and about the activity, competencies, and skills that comprise an information landscape, and to draw meaning from the sources through engagement and experience with information. The enactment of information literacy, therefore, is relational, it's embodied, it's material, it's consequential, and it's recursive. And the model that's presented here has been really pared down to emphasise a number of elements to information practice, and that's site, modalities, and enactment. And the elements of this model can be built upon to encompass the features of specific sites through which the practice of information literacy emerges. Okay, so how does information literacy happen? These studies highlight a social complexity of information literacy, and they identify and describe the modalities that contribute to the construction of a landscape. And from these studies, there are a number of key themes about information literacy, which highlight the importance of information everywhere. So we're just going to talk about these themes. The first one is about information landscape. Now, it's been an enduring theme of my research career in library and information science, and it forms the basis for the methodology that I employ in information literacy practice. Information landscapes represent the community spaces which evolves from interaction that we have with sources, with other people as sources, and with things in the context of a specific setting. And it's the key concept in my work, and it emerged in my PhD in 2004. So the landscape we build, it references our lived experience, our life world, and it's our experiences of information environments and the shape of our information practices. And information landscapes are also referenced when we undertake information literacy practice. So whether it's the teaching of it or it's the learning of it. So to buy in and become positioned as an insider within a community requires access to information that is valued and it's relevant to people engaged in joint enterprise within that space. So, for example, in a health setting, the joint enterprise within the space may focus on a patient, but the information landscape will also be constructed via the patient's ongoing interactions with the medical profession, with their people, with their supporters, with their family, their allied health, and other things that happen within that space. So entering the space and navigating its paths, its nodes, and its edges require an ability to understand the discourse and the narratives of the landscape. So how to adhere to, say, medical advice, with whom do you discuss health? They also require an understanding of how that landscape connects to other landscapes within the health environment. Now, I'm going to show you the diagram again, and I'm sorry if it is really blurry, but what this diagram is trying to demonstrate is that there's a real intersection of landscapes that we build. It's not just a single landscape. People have multiple landscapes in their life world, and they all connect to each other. So in some way. So I mean, that's kind of how we build our world with these information landscapes. Okay, so we're just going to move on to some themes now. So there are three themes. There are three sort of themes and three dimensions that I just wanted to talk to that come out of the research that also sort of demonstrate what a practice perspective can do. All right, so the everyday life of people is structured in relation to information environments, modalities of information landscapes. The term information modality, it references the type of information and the ways of knowing valued within the information environment. And each modality, which is also we could just say sources, acts as a site of and for knowledge, and it mediates the enactment of specific activities that are related to knowledge. So it's important to acknowledge that the modalities They're not mutually exclusive, but they are mutually constituted and they're entwined. And as such, each modality references explicit and tacit information and ways of knowing. And we'll go through these quite, briefly. The first one is the epistemic instrumental modality. It's the one, as librarians, we probably know more about than any of the others, all right? So it describes sources of information that are objective, factual, and they're reproducible. And the modality references the normative aspects of rules, regulations that are necessary to operate in society in everyday life. So policies, practices. The modality is encountered and experienced via text, all right? So for example, physical documents or online text. All participants in all of my studies drew from textbooks in some way, which operationalized the routine and the procedural elements of work practice. So they had to know the rules and the regulations. However, they also drew of other modalities. And so they drew from social modality, and this was one of the major findings in my studies, is that it refers to more nuanced types of information that are formed around the often unwritten norms or conventions of practice and or social exchange. So for example, all participants in every study cited that talking to other people was a main source of information and a verification of information. I mean, if you think about your own practices, people are important. People check in with each other and they learn from each other about the way in which a social site, whether it's a workplace, a school, a university, a library, shopping centres, sporting fields, how they operate. And people, when they were doing that, they drew from very nuanced and vernacular knowledges, so local knowledges, which only come from the lived, embodied experience of being in place. So information literacy is really not a practice that actually requires text. Information literacy has to take the shape of the context. So not all information is expressed in written form, but is relevant or reliant on people encountering and engaging other people. So talking, listening, observing in the workplaces and the communities that I've studied, tapping into knowledge or a key piece of information sometimes can only happen at the moment of practice. And in that way, that information is not expressed or written down anywhere. And it's particularly true in the work that we did in the restoration community, where people really kind of didn't write down a lot of things. It was all up in their heads. I mean, these were older men who knew a lot about cars, but they didn't write anything down. People needed to make a connection with each other in order to access that information. Similarly, in the refugee communities, and I've worked with refugee communities for the last 10 years, participants in those studies, they often went to church, and the church was important, but the important event happened afterwards when the members of the congregation, they'd gather for morning tea. So participants in the study, they reported that that was the best time to find information about legal matters, about what work might be available, about study opportunities. It always came via via word of mouth. And in the COVID studies that I've done with my colleague, Alison Hicks, participants reported in the early periods of the pandemic, and I'm sure we all did this as well, coming together. They came together in smaller groups or in friendship groups to pool information to help better their understanding of what was going on in all that chaos. And in all these instances, information was drawn from everywhere, from every small crevice to help understanding and meaning making. And the final one, which I think people are the most interested in sometimes, is the corporeal modality. So it references physical information that's drawn from the body and the embodied performances of practice, which are often contingent. So they're happening at the same time, and they're very nuanced. So, for example, firefighters, they learn about fire sense through their bodies as they practice firefighting. Nurses learn about patients through their touch, and they also learn about how to cannulate a patient on dialysis by developing a sense of touch through their fingers. Ambulance officers develop a sixth sense about danger in particular settings through their bodies and through observing the bodies and the physical surroundings at a scene. And chronically ill patients, the work that we did with them, it really highlighted how the physical modality represents a side of corporeal and material sources and is accessed through the body. And that acts as a collector and a site of sensory information. So becoming and then being chronically ill is a physical experience, and the body becomes a central feature of the information landscape. So in this respect, bodies are really central source of information, and the meaning that we make of information is made visible through our bodies. Bodies and embodied information are therefore central to the practice of information literacy. And I actually think that in general, at this stage, although it is changing, insufficient attention has been paid to the role of the body as a source of situated and embodied information in our field, also in education. And in this sector, the body, it remains an absent presence. So it's absent in the sense that while information science has focused on more the cognitive approach to individual behaviour, it has paid little attention to corporally produced information or the practices used to access and read this information. And that's led to, it's led to us minimising what we consider to be knowledge. So those three modalities, they don't exist independently of one another, but they're entwined. So, for example, again, if we look at a health information environment, people diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, they must engage with formal medical knowledge, with institutional knowledge that's related to the hospitals and the rules and the regulations. They have to engage with technical knowledge that's related to the dialysis that they're doing, particularly if they're dialysing at home. They have to really understand what's happening with the machines they're using. They also have to engage with social information, so learning about tacit or contingent practices associated with the disease and connecting with and learning from the narratives of other people who have CKD, and they have to become part of a CKD community. So it's quite complex. And that leads to the second kind of major theme, which is around the kind of dimensions of information literacy. Now, I know, and hopefully you're starting to see that it's not just a textual practice, but more importantly, it's a social practice where it relates to the interaction, and also a corporeal practice where it relates to embodied action and in relation to the material artifacts and the embodied actors of our performance. So when we act in a world of people-made and natural objects, which mediate the cultural sites through which they are situated. So information literacy is constituted, therefore, through the whole person being in and interacting with the world and its information and knowledge. And while being enacted into practice of information literacy in a particular setting, it actually occurs in three dimensions, and they also reference those modalities of information. And we'll just look at those briefly. So instrumental, the rational dimension, it reflects the cultural discursive conditions of the setting, and that is represented through the epistemic modality, where information, of course, is explicit, it's objective, and it's reproducible. It's the kind of information that we deal with all the time. Emergency care and health workers, they were learning about the normative features and the conditions of their practice by connecting with the rules and the regulations of their practice. Refugees, they also learn about rules and regulations that are laid down by their receiving country or their aid organisations. During the pandemic, people learn about new rules that were related to everyday life via the rules and the regulations that were produced by governments and health departments. And I was in the UK during that time, and there was a lot of rules and regulations that were being sort of disseminated on a daily basis. So it was quite hard to keep up with a lot of that sort of health information. The other dimensions are the material economic dimension, and that's a space which creates the preconditions for practice, so work activity. Now, these preconditions, they enable or constrain the doings that are characterised of a practice. So in the way that information is circulated, in the way it's accessed, the type of technologies that might be used, and the type of technologies and sort of skills and activities that are agreed upon. The material economic conditions are reflected both in the corporeal modality, and that modality, that it reflects embodied ways of knowing. So it's where expertise lies. in the workplace or in a sporting situation, the way in which the practices are operationalized are governed by the setting, and the way a team practices soccer or netball, or the way in which things might be done in the workplace. And then the final one is the historical social dimension. Now, in that dimension, we are setting up the preconditions of the social space, and it relates to power and solidarity. So within this dimension, it's where shared meaning is happening, and also where we find these teleoaffective features. So information in this modality, it's nuanced and it's often difficult to express in written form. Activities associated with this modality relate to activities through which information is shared in the process of negotiation. It's where we learn to participate, and also where we negotiate meaning through our membership of a particular group. The sharing of social information, people become aligned to their setting. So students learn how to operate within a library. They learn how to become students within a university. Firemen learn how to become firemen through this particular dimension. And it's a space where we learn by doing, by observing, and accessing information when it occurs at the moment of practice. So when we deliver information literacy education as instructors, we are in fact attempting to inculcate our students into specific discourses and associated discursive practices. And we do this by encouraging an intersubjective understanding of the practice. I mean, we hope by the time we've talked about, or we've engaged in information literacy instruction, at the end of it, that students will start to share the same sort of language and understanding that we have. Okay. So approaching information literacy using a research practical theoretical approach, and we're kind of towards the end now of this particular presentation. So a practice lens enables us to focus on the texture of information literacy by engaging us philosophically, by focusing on the constituent role of information literacy within the setting. So it allows us to think about the why of the practice. So why is information literacy practice fundamental to this social site? Theoretically, by focusing on the relations between people and the actions that are taken in relation to information. So focusing on the semantic spaces, the sayings that shape participants' understanding of their site. So attention's paid to specific context, to the conduct of practices, its organisation in space and in time, and the arrangements that make it possible and hold it in place. The specific explanation for the practice. So really it can give us the how of a practice lens by looking at relationships and explanations. And then empirically, by focusing on the centrality of people's actions in relation to information. So the doing of practice, which allows us to think about the what of practice. And up here you can see that this is my definition of information literacy, though it's kind of emerged around about 2003 when I wrote about information literacy for the first time, but it's been sort of enhanced and changed over the last couple of years. Rightio. So entry points to information literacy landscape. So researchers of information literacy who explore information seeking and the use of and use elements of information literacy, they enter the model with a focus on understanding how the social structure of the site shapes the discourses and the narratives of the site. So questions relating to researchers' entry into the model are about the how and the why the practice emerges, and the relationships that can explain the dynamics of the site in relation to the shaping of practices. So researchers might enter the model through why questions that we sort of have just talked about, and we talked about a bit earlier, that are often embedded in investigations of information practice that are more kind of sociologically and dialogically focused. So in describing a social ontology, Schatzky states that the social site is a field of embodied, materially interwoven practices that are centrally organised around practical understandings. So the philosophical entrant therefore aims to describe and problematise the traditions that are inherent in the structuring of the practice. So you can see with the research will start with understanding the environment, the information environment, how it's shaped. Practitioners, on the other hand, they could enter in another way. They might enter an information literacy landscape by focusing on the literacies of information at an empirical level, and they might describe the elements of the practice. So what are the activities and what are the skills that represent the enactment of the sayings and the doings of the site. So they still need to be aware of the information environment and the modalities that are important, but they're coming in at a more operational level. And from this entry point, information literacies and activities are emphasised, along with the epistemic modalities of information that reflect the normative conditions of information literacy instruction. And this is in my 2017 paper. How you do that? Techniques and methods, all right? So methodologically, information literacy needs to be interrogated, both intersubjectively to gain an understanding of how that practice is shaped and enabled or constrained. So there we're talking about power, and subjectively to understand the subjective nature of the lived experience through the information landscape that is constructed. So I think that qualitative techniques and art-informed techniques, they really enable researchers to capture methodologically the doing of the practice as they are referenced through language, through sayings, or as they're operationalised through performance, through the doings. When the framework for analysis is practice perspective, the methodological approach will focus on how the landscape of information literacy is constructed. And you can see in this slide, there are lots of different ways of doing it: interviews, focus groups, observation, interview to the double, which I have used quite successfully, and it's increasingly starting to be used, case study, photo voice, drawing, craft in relation to narrative and storytelling. We've used craft with refugees as a way of trying to understand what their lived experience and the informational elements of that lived experience. Photo voice, I think, is always a really fun one to use as well. So there's lots of ways of doing this kind of practice-orientated information literacy research. There's lots of questions that you might kind of ask. They're all up there. So what sources are important? You need to identify the context and what are the discourses that shape instrumental or institutional ways of knowing. You need to think about social sources, what nuanced and experiential ways of knowing. Sometimes we call that the tricks of the trade as well. So, as a librarian, there's lots of ways of doing things, but then, people develop their own shortcuts. And they're kind of like, and they can be very effective. Epistemic, so again, textual sources, the rules, the regulations, corporeal sources, bodies, performances. We need to think about how we encourage narratives of knowing or ways of knowing, because that allows us to also understand how expertise was developed and also what enables or constrains knowing in a specific setting, because that also allows us to start to think about what is absent, where are the absences, and how is identity shaped, enabled or constrained. I mean, information literacy shapes people's identity because it teaches them to engage with information in particular ways. So information, of course, is therefore referenced across those three modalities: epistemic, social, and corporeal. And that kind of leads me to a conclusion in the last slide. So in presenting this theory in the model, a set of ideas I've presented to explain information literacy as a practice that is shaped by the social side and that promotes certain knowledges and enactments. Now, the model doesn't highlight specific features, activities, or competencies, or skills or behaviours, because I argue that these are context dependent. So this model underlies all the things that you then put onto it. Instead, it focuses on the abstract features of the practice, regardless of the context, which are foundational to understanding the enactment. The model privileges neither scholarly nor practitioner spaces, but it views them as part of the same landscape of information literacy. So the use of practice and practice theory, it promotes a much deeper analysis and an understanding of the role that context plays in the shaping of information literacy and the bundle of activities and arrangements through which it unfolds. And they, again, of course, are different in different contexts, specifically by framing information through practice theory, we consider how the relationship between people and information is enabled and constrained. And when a practice theory perspective is applied to information literacy, it draws us deeper into ontological and epistemological questions from where we can interrogate and where we can unpack the practices and make it evident that information literacy cannot simply be reduced to a competency-based view. Instead, a practice theory approach helps us to recognise that the power of the practice lies in the realisation of its centrality to the lived experience of people as they engage in social, in everyday life. And that is the end of my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Annamaree. And at this point, we will open it up for questions. If you want to type a question into the Q&A, we can read that for you. If there's something you'd rather just verbally express, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask a question.
Okay, we do have a question in the Q&A. So I will read that out. Gina has said, I'm curious why the term framework of information literacy is more appropriate here rather than something like Nor/Satina's epistemic culturals. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm having problems reading today. Let me pop it in the chat for you so you can read it.
Oh, okay. Look, yeah, all right. I use framework, just the term framework is just a way of describing what is happening. So Norsatina's work around epistemic cultures is much more complex, and I do draw from that. If you read my work, you'll see that I actually draw from some of their, and I'm influenced by their work, but I use framework in a more descriptive sense. And I think of culture in a more anthropological sense. So I hope that answers that question for you. And I can see someone's said, can I describe interview to the double? Yes, interview to the double is fun. It's fun. It is not a, I'll just say, preface that by saying that it is not a technique or a method that you use singularly. You have to use it with a series of interviews, and it's something that you will tack on to the end of an interview schedule. And so what you're doing, I hope I explained this properly. What you're doing is you are getting your participant to, you're saying to your participant, tomorrow you really need to have the day off work, but your boss has told you you cannot have the day off work. So you have to get a double. You have to find someone who is exactly you, and they're going to take your place. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to tell that double everything they need to know about your day, about your working day, about the things that you'll have to do, all the things that are important to you on that day, so that your boss doesn't know you've been replaced. And then you let them give their double advice. Now, I've just examined a doctoral thesis, which was fabulous, where they're actors and they use this technique where the actors were then asked to tell the image of themselves how to be an actor. And what it does is it allows people to kind of really just talk about what their work life, and think about all the little things that they do, all the little sources of information, or the places where they go to seek information that might not necessarily come out of a more kind of even an open interview schedule. So it's quite a fun technique to use. David Nicolini really developed this technique, and it's being used in practice theory. And I think that it kind of has quite a lot of relevance to libraries as well. Like when we're teaching or we're wanting to know about students' information like their landscapes. I think it's a really neat technique to be able to sort of work out, where the paths, nodes, and edges of those landscapes are, and what kinds of information people are relying on Certainly when I worked with firefighters, and I didn't use this technique then because I didn't know about it, but a long time ago when I worked with firefighters, it was, I went in to do a text-based information literacy standard PhD, and they didn't talk about text, they talked about their bodies. And that really changed the way I started to see information literacy. And I think if I had have known about interview to the double then, it's where I would have used that technique. I hope that answered your question.
That is really interesting. Thank you. I had a question. You mentioned your definition of information literacy has been evolving since you sort of started writing on this early 2000s. Can you say a little bit more about how it's evolved, what sort of influenced that?
Yeah, I can. So when I sort of started to write about information literacy, I was in a workplace context. I was a TAFE, a vocational education librarian doing a PhD, and I was running a vocational education library. And so I kind of had a really, at that stage we were, and also at that stage in the information literacy sort of journey for all of us, we were still thinking about it as skills. And we were kind of thinking about it as competencies. And I saw it in 2003, I wrote about it as being a meta competency. So really it was about the operationalized of skills. And it is that still to some respect. But as I engaged more with practice theory after I'd finished my PhD, I really started to see that, that information literacy is something that's practiced, but it's also practiced. So it's a practice that we do, but it's also practiced by people. And therefore, the definition had to kind of evolve to take in the complexity of that, idea that, you know, that information literacy is not just something that you receive, but it's something that you live. And so the definition has evolved right up, and so I've sort of had different versions of it, but since about 2017 it's been that particular version to really kind of relay how complex this particular practice is, and also how central this practice is to our everyday lives. I mean, you know, we live in a world that's full of sort of information where everything's being contested, and it's beyond my understanding why people aren't jumping up and down screaming about we need information literacy education. We need librarians to be really engaged in this and really helping us, and I think it's because we kind of try to reduce it down to skills rather than make it a bit more complex than what it, because it is a complex thing. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple more questions in the Q&A, so I'll read the first one. It says, given your model's focus on the situated and multimodal, I'd appreciate your perspective on discussions about information literacy as its own unique academic discipline, which you kind of touched on a little bit, its complexity and how we reduce it to skills and stuff.
Oh, okay. Look, I don't see information literacy as a discipline. Okay, it's not a discipline. It's a field of study that sits within library and information science. I mean, if it's a discipline, what is it a discipline of? So I really see, and I mean, this is my current view about this. I hope that in 20 years' time it does become a discipline, but I don't think it's there yet. I think that it is a field of study, that it's part of library and information science, and that library and information science is the discipline that we sit underneath. Yeah, and I know there's some work there's some really good work that's happening at the moment around promoting this idea as information literacy as a discipline, and I do hope that work progresses and does take sort of does take off. But at this point in time, I don't see that it is a discipline. I mean, academically, people do not do a PhD in information literacy. They don't graduate with a degree in information literacy. They graduate with a degree in library and information science or library and information management, and their PhD is awarded by the university, but their topic might be information literacy, even though as a discipline, you know, I can see that there are some soft skills, some soft sort of disciplinary ideas about, you know, having journals, which we do, and you know, having conferences, which we do, but then lots of other fields do the same thing, and they're not considered to be disciplines either. So, you know, I'd like to know who the anonymous attender who has asked that question is, because I'm quite happy to have a chat with them about it. And I really do hope that, you know, in 20 years' time, the work that's being done now does end up that way. But right now, I don't really sort of see it as being that way. There's not enough work that's been done in this way to think about information literacy as a discipline.
Can I ask a follow-up question? What do you think it needs to be its own discipline?
Sorry, did you say, so this question by Susan, how might educators redesign information literacy? Is that the question we're up to?
Yes, I was just asking a follow-up question.
Oh, sorry.
Just like what you think it would need to be its own discipline, like what criteria?
Oh, well, I think that it needs well, I mean, you know, information literacy is taught in libraries, and it's taught at the subject, it is taught in some places as a single subject. So we call them subjects. You might call them courses in the US. I'm not sure. But you know, as a single topic, as a single subject that might run over a semester or whatever, what it would need is a really in-depth program that ran from where you start engaging with information literacy from your first year right through, and there is a well-defined sequence of curricula that would take you from first year through to your final year as a university student, and that it's really kind of well planned out. So say, you know, I'm an archaeologist, all right? So when I started as an archaeologist, I did archaeology. So I had to do things like prehistory, I had to do anthropology, I had to do a range of subjects which were comparative and would help me with the development of my archaeological understanding. As a librarianship, when I went to study librarianship, you know, I had to learn cat and class. I had to learn all of the subjects that make up being a librarian. And I think that that's where you have to go with information literacy. If you want to make it a discipline, then you really kind of need to start thinking about how it plays out as a subject with lots of different curricula. So
yeah,
I think it can be done. I think it can be done, but I do think it just going to take a bit more work. So
okay, so now we'll move on to the next question, which is how might educators redesign information literacy instruction to better reflect the embodied social and contextual nature of information practice that students will encounter beyond academic settings?
Yeah, okay. So in 2007 I wrote a chapter in a book called Workplace Information Literacy, and it was called Learning from Within for Beyond. And I set out a program of study. I sent out a program of study for that, and I think that that, you know, one-off information literacy topics are unavoidable. I mean, you know, libraries get one shot at it sometimes, but I really think there should be more advocacy about how you teach information literacy. And again, start in first year, where you are orientating students to the library, to library-based sources, to the way they're used in academic settings. So you're really getting them to understand the institutional discourses that drive their operation within the library and within a university. But as they start to move into their sort of second years, I think that the program needs to be, or their intermediate years, the program needs to really kind of start to develop the kind of reflective practices that people might have. So you're starting to get people to think about transitioning into a workplace. And by the time you get to the final year, I think that librarians should really be starting to they should know a lot more about the workplaces that their students are going into, like because not all students are going to stay in academia. So you need to start to think about, well, what are the practices and things in the workplace that we need to start to think about? And that's where, you start to think about, well, can we teach observational skills? Can we teach more social skills around, you know, around using another person as a social source of information. How do we get students to think about information that's nuanced? I mean, students come out of universities and they never ever use the databases that they've been trained on. But what they do is they go and ask Bryn, who's next door, and they say, Bryn, what do you do? Or they say to Rebecca, how do you do that? You know, so we need to think about how we develop a more sort of a program that really focuses on transition, and that it also enables resilience as well, so that what we do is we've got students who are graduating out of university who are more resilient with information use as well, and understand that it's more than just, you know, standing there looking at a database, that it's lots of other things. And I actually think that kind of requires librarians to be all given lots of funding, and so they can get out on study visits to workplaces, so they can really understand. It's the only way I really learned about information literacy. Because I was a TAFE librarian, I was teaching, I'm sorry if we're running out of time, TAFE librarian, I was teaching information literacy in the library to welders. And I thought I was teaching them about, you know, the rules, the regulations, OH&S, how to use a computer. And I had them for a week, which was terrifying. And they, at the end of the third day, the side bookshelves collapsed on me. And I found what they had been doing, they hadn't been listening to me, they'd been undoing the bolts on the stack. And, you know, they thought it was hilarious. So I thumped my way over to the training centre and I found the Master of Apprentices. And I said to him, do you know what they've done? I'm trying to teach them how to do information literacy. And he said, that's not information literacy. He said, come over here and spend the day with me. And I did. I went, and what I saw was a different thing. I saw people watching each other. I saw them talking to each other. I saw them sort of listening to what was going on. And I thought, well, these are all informational skills. They're all stuff. It's all skills that allow us to engage with information. And that's what changed my, and then the firefighters started talking about their bodies. So, you know, so I think that's you know, trying to encourage a broader view of what happens outside our settings is really important, because we're librarians. I mean, we know about information and we know about lots of forms of it. So, you know, we need to extend our role.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that?
Yeah. Yep.
Sort of outside of the spaces of education and workplace, just thinking about everyday life, how do you think this sort of connects to the way librarians might prepare students for their information literacy practices just broadly?
So do you mean, are you talking about sort of public librarians, or are you talking about academic librarians, or just librarians in general?
I was thinking academic librarians, but I think if you have thoughts for public librarians as well.
Well, you know, I think that information literacy is not really well sort of dealt with in public libraries as well, which is where, you know, the majority of people will turn up at a library at some stage for, you know, information. So I kind of think that again, I think it's context dependent. So I think that an awareness of what's happening, an awareness that's what's happening in your community or in your social space will kind of, if you're a public librarian, it kind of can be the catalyst to say, well, we could, you know, we could really engage in some information literacy programs around understanding what misinformation and disinformation is. We could target some groups that we think are not in the library or are missing out on that kind of information expertise that we've got. We could perhaps run particular courses for particular groups. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about it. But I think it actually requires us to be a bit brave and to kind of step outside of our comfort zone. And as educators, so people who are teaching information literacy to students in library courses, I think we need to be braver as well. I think that we need to start saying to people, well, you know, this is an opportunity. You've got to think of where the opportunities are for you to insert your expertise. And that sometimes, you know, takes a bit of a step.
Christine in the chat calls it information literacy for civic life.
Yep.
And we have another question actually about public libraries and public librarianship. Amber asks, public librarianship seems to be slowly integrated into a network of social information instead of being historically a means of gatekeeping. How do we promote literacy without accidentally stepping back into the practices of elitism?
Yeah, well, I think that that is the challenge, and I think that just sort of speaks to what we're just talking about. There is that I think that we need to become more civically aware of what's happening in our settings. I mean, some people work in public libraries in big cities, and it's kind of really hard to kind of get the pulse of the city. But then other librarians work in small libraries. So I know in my public library here, when I was living in Australia, we had a lot of refugees who came in, and we recognised, and I did a lot of research that's been published about this work, and so I proposed that the library run a thing called Language Cafe, so that we could offer this service to people who were coming into the country whose English was not good or non-existent, who were waiting to get into courses at the local TAFE. And so we ran this Language Cafe, which is still run today, 3 days a week, where people can come for an hour and a half and talk to someone just about anything, about information, about where they get information. They can bring their bills in, and you can help talk. So we kind of tapped into that was a real need in our community, and that wasn't a need for structured information literacy education, but it was a need for a more informal way of ensuring that people were engaging with the information that they needed, and in that process learning information literacy practice that had a very particular shape. So again, it always depends on the context. So
Thank you. So I am really interested in this idea, and I think others here are as well, of information landscapes as sort of a way to just think about where and how we are situated. So if I were interested in kind of reflecting on and describing my own information landscape, what kinds of questions am I asking myself that would help me sort of describe or define what that looks like?
right, okay. So information landscapes are made up of smaller landscapes, all right. And it's what I'm writing about it at the moment. I don't think I've really explained it properly, sort of in all the things where I've talked about it. But we draw down from information environment. So if we use health, all right, as an information environment, it's got lots of different elements to it. So when you're developing your information landscape, your own internal landscape, you'll draw down on information that is relevant to your particular needs. All right. So it could be you'll draw from different sources of information. So you might, if you're a patient that's chronically ill, so the CKD patients that we worked with, they were kind of they were drawing down, they were watching the machines, they were learning, so they were engaging with that kind of technology to understand how the machine was working with them. They had to have that knowledge. So they were creating that landscape with that technology. They were also creating information and building a landscape around the sources of information that they needed. And when they were doing that, they were then using that information to draw in their supporters, the people that were going to be their allies. And so they were kind of telling them what they needed to know as well. So it becomes quite complicated. They also kind of, they had to know about the rules, the regulations, all the things that the hospital needed them to know as well. So they were drawing off all of those modalities. What I'm saying is that the model is very general. Okay, and you kind of fit into it what you need to fit into it. So like in terms of what kinds of information you need. But the other thing that's not dealt with in that model is that people avoid information as well. So and how that exactly fits in, I'm not really sure at the moment. But so you might have multiple landscapes in your own life, in your lived world. So there might be one around health if you're chronically ill. There might be one about knitting. If you're a knitter, I'm a knitter. All right, I have this whole landscape around knitting. All right, so I watch people knit, and I engage with knitting. If you play sport, you'll have a different kind of, there'll be another landscape around sport, and you might really draw heavily off the corporeal modality because you're watching and you're playing a game. Yeah, does that answer your question?
I think so. So if you're a person like me who just kind of wants to start reflecting on this and understanding it better, is it questions as simple as what are the information sources that are important to me
Yeah. So in
in
that
this
slide,
moment?
yeah, in that second slide, last slide, there were sort of places. So what kinds of information do I really need? Where does that information come from? So you think about, well, where does that information come from, and what source is that coming from now? And then of course your library training jumps in, and you go, well, is that a credible source, or do I think that that's sort of just an opinion? And and does that help me understand what are the discourses that are enabling and constraining me to find information, and how's that information being presented? So you want to think of questions that sit at an ontological level. So you're thinking about the view of knowledge, what constitutes and is sanctioned as knowledge in that particular setting, and you might ask questions about that. But then you'll ask yourself questions about how is information literacy, how is it operationalized here? Like, what does that practice look like? And does that practice fit in with this kind of ontological view that I'm sort of seeing? So you're kind of chipping down at the practice to sort of see how it's shaped, because it's always really about how is that practice shaped. So, and I think in an earlier slide, there were a series of questions that you could ask yourself as well. And then, you think about that methodologically as well. So, but I think that an important element is reflection. All right, so really reflection on your practice and your praxis is really an important thing that, and I think that we are, we're encouraging students to learn that, to learn those skills. But I think that it's something that we probably need to emphasize a lot more, because the world is so complicated now, and there's so many sources of information, and 90% of them are just not right. That we kind of really, that's why I think that information literacy is so central to every aspect of our life. So, and it threads through everything that we do. So, yeah.
I think you're preaching to the choir on on that one.
Okay.
I'm going to ask the AI question. How might your ideas about social modality help us think through the implications? Oh, look, I don't know. I did write a paper a couple of years ago called, I think it was called Chasing Frankenstein's Monster, which was about AI. Ideas about the social modality help us think through the implications of, yeah, well, I think that, again, I think, and I'm not really sure I'm going to answer this question that well, because I haven't actually thought very much about this, but I think that that the way we deal with AI, like we think about the social modality, we're going to have to think about where that information is coming from. And it's going to require us to kind of really interrogate to interrogate what we understand about AI, where it's being developed, who's developing it. And I think that there's going to be more of we need to think more about the search process as well, and how that's being driven by AI. Again, it has a social element to it because it's being created by people. So we kind of need to think about, what is the aim of this sort of AI? Yeah, I can't really answer that any more than that. I'm sorry. It's a good topic, but I mean, if someone wants to write a PhD on that, let me know.
So I have kind of a basic question. So can you kind of give some tips or starting points for librarians if they want to start going outside the library to learn more about these information literacies and landscapes, just to better understand or study or observe people's practices. Because I think that's really important for us. In some ways we are kind of still the people that sit behind our desk and wait for people to come to us.
Yeah.
So if you could kind of what are some ways people can start doing that or ease into it?
Yeah, talk to people. Go and talk to go into the departments and talk to people who are new or people who are just starting out. I think it'd be a great project if libraries were able to interview new academic staff who are coming out of practice and into academia the first 12 months, because after that they lose their kind of a lot of their practice knowledge. So it's about capturing practice knowledge. All right. So that could be something that, that could be part of someone's orientation, that the library sort of, says, well, this person comes from geology. Let's kind of talk to them about what it's like to be a geologist in this first 12 months before they become inculcated into this institutional discourse. So that way, you don't actually have to leave the university, but that's one way of doing that. The other way is to undertake small projects where you go into a setting that you might be particularly, you might be servicing some area in science, and you might be able to go into a lab and maybe spend a day watching what people do and interviewing people about how they kind of deal with information. So the textual stuff's easy, all right, because they'll all tell you, I use textbooks, I blah blah, I do this, I read the rules, I know the regulations. What you're trying to capture is the other stuff. How do they work together? Are they talking to each other? Are they asking each other questions? What are they drawing from when they sort of answer? Are they drawing from their kind of tricks of the trade, or their kind of their tacit knowledge? And then how do their bodies operate when they're in that setting as well? So are they watching each other do things, or are they doing something and then redoing it? So they're learning about how to do something. So there are kind of it's a different, you've got to think of information as being more than just text, which is what we're trained. That's how we're trained. So we're kind of unlearning some of that and learning that there are other modalities that shape people's information experience. And in a lot of cases, those modalities are far more important than the text. So, and that then allows you to start to think about how you might shape a program that, has those elements in it. So, you might have students who are kind of working together, and then you might sort of have questions for them about how did they engage with each other, and what did they think the information was, and how are they getting information. So because information literacy is about a way of knowing. So, and that's what you're trying to find out. So new academics who've only been in for 6 months, who are all still green and still in the practice frame of mind, really good to interview. But also there are other smaller, maybe smaller projects where you can talk to people who are actually in practice. So maybe even if it was just for a day. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
And you're seeing my face again because our time is drawn to a close. Can the audience please thank Anne-Marie and our moderators, Bryn and Rebecca, for today.
Thanks very much for listening to me.
This is truly wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to Loyola Marymount University for its support of the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. Thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, for your consistent support of IRDL since 2014. Thank you to the team that labored to put together this learning event. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you